I think that we should get welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming to our special lunchtime curatorial short talk. The curatorial shorts are a series of talks at the Columbia RBML about new acquisitions and new research and findings from the collection. And I am very pleased to introduce Lukas Moe today. Lukas teaches in the English department at San Jose State University. And it is a special pleasure to introduce him because he is my sibling. And one of the things that we share is a love of archives and literary research. So today he will be talking about a momentous time in Columbia's history, as well as in the history of American radical movements. And his question is, what was the role of poetry in 1968? I'm going to turn it over to Lukas and go off screen for the presentation. But in the meantime, please feel free to put comments and questions in the Q&A, and we can turn to them after Lukas's presentation. Thank you so much, Lukas. Over to you.
All right, thanks, Lena. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to share with you all the findings I've made in the 1968 Columbian Crisis Archive at the RBML. So what I'm going to do is just take us through a slideshow that will kind of throw a lot of images and text and bits of text at you, and then we can talk about any of it that you find most intriguing, and I can circle back. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, so the poetry of Columbia's 68 student strike. That is what it should say on my screen. Please let me know if it doesn't. And all the photographs and documents are from the online exhibition, 1968 Columbian Crisis. The first picture here is a mass of people heading to Low Library after a SAS SDS sundial rally. So I'll get to what SAS and SDS mean in this context, but April 1968. Kind of some background images from the archive that are strikingly beautiful. I think on the left is an image from the area around Columbia and Harlem, young children demonstrating along with adults. And notice, I mean, the message being sent here: Columbia, get the hell out and stay out. I should say at the top here, there will be some obscenity in this presentation. So if you want to mute your screens at any point, I just want to forewarn you of that. I'll try to keep it to a minimum. And on the right, a beautiful color image of Columbia students, as well as faculty. The faculty are the ones wearing the white armbands, who have gathered outside, on this beautiful spring day here. And they seem to be milling about, not sure what's going on yet. Some more background. So sorry about the text there. Society of African American Students, SAS. So the demands being made at the time in 67, really beginning in 1967, were focused on a set of issues. And the kind of mythology of the Columbia strike in 68 is that the impulse flowed from, on the one side, African American students who were focused on the kind of gobbling up of land in Upper Manhattan and Harlem, and Columbia purchasing more and more land, and in particular the construction of a gym. So this was going to be the Morningside Gym, and so that's number 2 here in the list of demands. And you see the pun on Jim Crow on the right. So that was, on the one hand, the impulse from African-American students. On the other hand, as we'll get to in a moment, was the sort of new left SDS contingent. African-American students occupied Hamilton Hall. So here's an image of the food pantry on the left, and then people, napping or whatever on the right. So, and then a split happened between the Black and white students, where the students occupying Hamilton Hall, quote unquote, evicted the white students. This kind of subversive play on, gentrification, as it were. But the main kind of point of tension between the two groups is that SAS was much more kind of programmatic in their demands and had very particular concrete things they wanted to get done and demands they wanted met. Whereas on the other hand, the SDS group was more free form. We'll get more into that. But in fact, you see a kind of racially integrated crowd here who are tearing down a fence at the construction site for the gymnasium. So the same day of that big rally we saw earlier. So then SDS, Students for Democratic Society, here's one of their buttons, courtesy Frank DeCruz, alum. This is what the SDS looked like on Columbia's campus. And here's Mark Rudd, who became sort of the face of the moment. And, we can put pressure on that, but he is the kind of iconic leader of Columbia 68. As it's gone down in history. So here he is in Fairweather, which I don't know the geography well enough of Columbia's campus, but famous image. This one made it into Life magazine. So David Shapiro, who had become a poet at the time, was a student, kicking back in President Grayson Kirk's office. He found the cigars. And if it reminds you of the image from the January 6th Capitol riot, kind of unmistakable, right? The person kicking back in the offices of the Speaker of the House. Not to invoke that immediately, but this is an incredible image of the students basically taking over the university, right? Outside during the building occupations, there was a pretty steady picket line where essentially you had kind of three kind of contending forces. You had the pro-strike students who were outside, supporting, obviously with their presence, but also just to get food into the buildings was a challenge. So they created a kind of tossing up to the windows kind of system of delivering food, which was interrupted and disrupted by the anti-strike students, or the what were colloquially called the jocks. So the jocks lined up too and kind of stopped some of this from happening. So there was fighting, and so the police were there to monitor the situation at this point. But you see from people's expressions, everybody's having a pretty good time. The police look relatively unperturbed by the situation. There's a student maybe having a beer, two students having beers here in the front. So the party-like atmosphere continues until the bust. So you see the little clip here from the Spectator on the left. Students were forcibly removed from buildings in the wee hours, and it was incredibly violent. I'll show some images from a film documentary in a moment, but you see people are being tossed around, literally, and kicked and punched and bloodied, and you see the baton of what appears to be a police person, but he has a kind of suit jacket on, but also a hard hat. Unclear who that is. These are probably students here who are throwing another student. And then in the coverage, in the aftermath of the bust, you see here May 18th and May 22nd, 1968, the internal divisions among the students become quite clear. Whereas the African-American students decided to, after the bust, after being, well, SAS was asked to leave their building before the most violent bust, which under a lot of pressure they did, and they did peaceably. Whereas the SDS contingent basically wanted to keep occupying and wanted to go back, right? And so there's a divide in what to do in the aftermath of the bust. So a lot was happening right now, and others might recall some of this better than I do, but it's really interesting to trace kind of the various actions people took right after the police crackdown on the occupation. So the gym was dropped, wasn't built. The administration agreed to that SAS demand. Yeah, so it wasn't that like all the demands were met, and indeed the SAS endorsed the boycotting of classes, the striking of classes after the bust. But they were working with the administration to make sure some of these changes got done, which they did. Creation of a Black Studies program and increase in Black faculty, notably. So documentary film, which I accessed through the New York newsreel. And if you just Google Columbia Revolt documentary, you'll find it. Really amazing footage. And here's some stills. So on the left, the guy wearing the hard hat that says IDA, that's the IDA was this kind of defense contractor that Columbia was housing at the time, sort of just war machine there on Columbia's campus that was being protested. So after the bust, then leading up to graduation, there were kind of sit-ins and teach-ins and strikes of academic activity. But there was also a Grateful Dead concert, not a Grateful Dead conference. That's what I would go to. Concert. And at the bottom of this flyer, notice an up against the wall production. What does that mean? We'll come back to that in a second. This became national news. I mean, you see this is a vintage paperback book about the Columbia crisis. It became sort of symbolic of broader protest movements and anti-war struggles in particular. And I just think it's interesting how in the wake of the January 6th riot, similar kind of, I don't know, popular, responsing popular consciousness. You can read about what happened, right? But 50 years later, here is the Columbia student student employee, I can't remember the correct title now, demonstrating in 2018. The struggle continues. And then another documentary film that came out in 2020, which is 15 hours long, and I haven't watched it. But it's supposed to be incredible. Here it was reviewed in The Guardian. Okay, so back to this up against the wall. I don't know, little bit of text here circulating that we're starting to notice. Up against the wall, mother effer cop. This was found in the mathematics building. And this again is from the RBML archive, this image. So after the bust, people went inside, took pictures, especially the destruction that it seems the police had just busted the building, had just torn things up. And then this is from the Columbia Revolt documentary. I noticed this young man who has been bludgeoned, it seems, and has an eye patch on. And so there he is, and what he's holding in his hands, that reads up against the wall, and then below you can't see MF. And I started to think, well, what is this phrase? How is it circulating? It made me think of course, a poem by Leroy Jones and Miri Baraka, but that's just me because, poetry. It turns out, and I didn't know this, that the Lower East Side SDS chapter at the time was called Up Against the Wall. That was one of its names. Before Up Against the Wall formed, the kind of precursor group was called Black Mask. You see these marchers here with the black balaclava masks. So in 1967, Black Mask became Up Against the Wall. And this was a kind of anarchist collective, which became the quote unquote Lower East Side SDS chapter, even though a lot of the people in it weren't students per se. And so then you start to see Up Against the Wall everywhere in the Columbia 68 archives. It was just part of the patois, and here's even a board game that was created where you could be like, the police, you could be the administration, you could be the students. So Up Against the Wall, published by Columbia University Students for a Democratic Society. Okay, so the Columbia SDS then adopts this banner. And here, reply to Uncle Grayson. This is Mark Rudd's famous open letter to President Grayson. You might want to know what is wrong with this society, writes Rudd, since after all, you live in a very tight, self-created dream world. We can point out your mansion window to the ghetto below you've helped to create through your racist university expansion policies, through your unfair labor practices, through your city government and your police. We can point to this university, your university, which trains us to be lawyers and engineers and managers for your IBM, your Saucony Mobile, your IDA, your Con Edison. We will fight you about your control of Black people in Morningside Heights, Harlem, and the campus itself. and we will fight you about the type of miseducation you're trying to channel us through. We will have to destroy at times, even violently, in order to end your power and your system. But that is a far cry from nihilism. So basically, Rudd is responding to the accusation of nihilism coming from the Columbia administration. These are just like, you know, insurrectionary nihilists, these SDS people. Rudd's open letter was reprinted in a Mexico City magazine, El Corno Emplumado, which I study. I thought it would be interesting for you to see the last sentences of his letter here printed in that magazine. So this was a radical kind of 60s poetry and art magazine. There's only one thing left to say. It may sound nihilistic to you since it is the opening shot in a war of liberation. I'll use the words from Leroy Jones, whom I'm sure you don't like a whole lot. Up against the wall, mother effer, this is a stick up. Yours for freedom, Mark. Okay, so, you know, this confirms the connection between Mark Rudd here in the upper left and Baraka, upper right. But also, and here I'll just, you know, I'll start to wrap up my talk by pointing to some directions in poetry that you know, that one could follow out of this crisis. Rachel Blau du Plessis was a graduate student at Columbia in 1968. So was Sharon Olds, just below her there. Bottom right, Kenneth Koch was a professor, of course, like legendary professor at Columbia at the time. And then bottom left, Lorenzo Thomas was a poet living in Long Island at the time. Grew up in New York City, born in Panama. We'll just touch on each of them briefly. Olds wrote a poem called May 1968. And, you know, it figures that she's kind of the biggest name out of the bunch, besides Baraka. But more of a mainstream poet. This was published in Poetry Magazine. So here you have the kind of opening lines. And Olds is lying down on the pavement, and the poem is this kind of ground view. She's looking up at the sky, but then she starts to see the police horses like hovering above her. And she kind of meditates on the fact that she thinks she's pregnant. So she's kind of counting the days in her menstrual cycle to kind of counting that, timing them to the chants that are happening around her. And so it's a really interesting poem. But it is a poem that takes the 68 protests, as she writes here, the dean of the university said the neighborhood people could not cross campus, i.e., you know, Black people. And subsumes it in this kind of quite personal first-person psychological lyric. Just really quick, Blau du Plessis, when the protests started in '68, she called Oppen on the phone, George Oppen, who actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 1968 for this book, Of Being Numerous. She called him up on the phone and asked him what he thought. I don't know Oppen's answer. All I know from du Plessis is that she called him. I'm hoping to learn more maybe about what he said, but basically, Blau du Plessis, something she said to Oppen in a letter, which is transcribed here, whether as the intensity of scene increases, one's distance from them, the people, does not also increase. Oppen took that and put it in Of Being Numerous, his poem. And then Lorenzo Thomas, a poem called Negritude, published in El Corno Emplumado, that Mexico City magazine in 1965, describes him taking the train all the way uptown. And I wonder where he starts, if it's Long Island or Queens. I know he was also living in Queens at one point. Mornings when I rise, that might remind you of a hymn in the Black spiritual tradition. Mornings when I rise, riding along subway all the way uptown, half asleep crossing the Columbia campus, me glowing in Ferris Booth's high glass. I'll just stop there. We can talk more about this poem if you want. But then the Baraka poem in question, here's an excerpt from Black People, published in an Evergreen Review, 1967. So the lines go, all the stores will open if you will say the magic words. The magic words are, up against the wall, motherfucker, this is a stick up. Or smash the window at night. These are magic actions. Smash the windows daytime, anytime, together. Let's smash the window, drag the shit from in there. No money down, no time to pay. Okay, so Baraka, the previous summer, during the Newark riots, where basically the army occupied Black Newark, Baraka was involved in resistance to this occupation. He was beaten up by the cops and arrested. You see on the left here, he's got a pretty bad gash here on his forehead. So he was arrested on a firearms charge, illegal possession of firearms, imprisoned. And then after his release, you see him here organizing in Newark. And this is really the turn into his more nationalist, Black Power, Black arts phase. And on the right, there he is in the mayor's office. Kenneth Gibson was elected the first Black mayor of Newark. Okay, so Baraka, here he is getting out of prison, out of jail or something. He's in cuffs, I think, in this picture, though. So I don't know what's happening precisely. And then on the right, there's Kenneth Koch in '69, looking pretty jovial, coming down the steps of the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial, or wherever they are, during a mass anti-war protest in '69. So you see the kind of contrast in their facial expressions. Baraka looking exhausted, kind of everything's utterly predictable about what's happening. No, he's not happy. Koch, he's, having a great time, it seems. So Koch, New York school poet, man about town. You go on endlessly about Kenneth Koch's New York poetry career. Here he is at the St. Mark's Poetry Project with Allen Ginsberg in the 1970s. Koch gave a poetry reading at St. Mark's in 1968, January 1968. So before the Columbia kind of student protest really reaches a boil. And it's a long story, but in brief, he's giving a reading and a man comes up to the front where he's reading his poems and fires a pistol twice. The shots were blank. Koch was fine. But this was a kind of, it's interesting how this event has been received, because what this was basically was somebody from Up Against the Wall, that Lower East Side SDS chapter, staging a quote unquote mock assassination of Koch. And he would have been, they thought he was a quote unquote bourgeois poet. So they stage a mock assassination. And Koch is visibly upset, flustered, mad when this happens. He tells the Up Against the Wall folks to get out. There's a few of them kind of maybe distributing leaflets in the back. tells them to scram, tells them to grow up. There's a really great recording of this event, which you can go listen to online. And so, yeah, so this happens a few months before the student protest. And one thing that Koch says after the man comes up and fires the pistol at him, he says, if this is about Leroy, meaning Baraka, then, you know, you all should be doing something else. This isn't the way to handle that situation or like to do anything about that, right? And one of the men from up against the wall shouts, "Poetry is revolution," as he leaves the building. Okay, so then right after this happens, Koch collects himself and he says, you know what, I'm gonna read this poem, The Pleasures of Peace. I was planning to read later in the reading, but I'm gonna do it now. And so he reads this poem, which published in the Paris Review in 1968. And here's just a little excerpt from it. "I love your work, The Pleasures of Peace," the professor said to me next day. "I think it adequately encompasses the hysteria of our era and puts certain people in their rightful place. Chapeau, bravo." "You don't get it," I said. "I like all this. I called this poem Pleasures of Peace because I'm not sure they will be lasting. I wanted people to be able to see what these pleasures are, that they may come back to them. But they're also hysterical, so transitory." So, okay, I have more of this poem if we want to look at it, but I thought I should kind of stop here. But just in these lines, you get a sense of how this poem, like a lot of Koch poems, is kind of a meta poetic. It's a meta-poetic poem in the sense that it's about sort of a poem that maybe somebody else wrote who's an alter ego of Koch. In this case, it's The Pleasures of Peace, and it seems to be a version of Koch who's written this poem, maybe a younger version. And I think it's really Koch imagining himself as one of the student protesters, as one of his students, because he's teaching at Columbia at the time. And among his students is David Shapiro, that guy we saw kicking back in Kirk's office with a cigar. But so, you know, the professor says here, it puts certain people in their rightful place, i.e. those anarchists that Koch said to get out of St. Mark's Poetry Project. And Koch's alter ego says, you don't get it. I want people to be able to see what these pleasures are, that they may come back to them. And so The Pleasures of Peace, right? This is an anti-war poem, which of course is timely for our moment today. Then finally, the last place one should know about where this phrase got taken up in kind of underground counterculture. Jefferson Airplane, not so underground at the time, was a really hugely popular band. So here's an LP with the cover Up Against the Wall, Mother F. And their version was Up Against the Wall, Mother America. So they then popularized this to another order of popularity, this phrase, Up Against the Wall. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lucas. So our attendees, I encourage you to put comments and chats in the Q&A section. It doesn't have to be fully formulated, but I think that Lucas would welcome feedback. I have a lot of thoughts. One is that, so in the last week I've been reading Toni Morrison's editorial work with Angela Davis, and a lot of it is, or some of their work is about how to sort of portray the splits that happen within radical movements. So Angela Davis is part of SNCC, and then LA SNCC is disbanded, and then she's part of the Black Panthers, and she finds a lot of I would say like a strong headwind of being a Black woman leader in the Black Panthers. And then she joins the Communist Party, and she's a member of the Communist Party while she's working for the Black Panthers. But there's a lot of strife among those groups. And I imagine that this is something that was being negotiated at Columbia too. And it's interesting that the kind of central figure of the story is Amiri Baraka. And I wonder, I guess, did you get a sense of how he felt about that, being the kind of gravitational center for some of these, I guess, linguistic borrowings of his work? And if he ever openly reflected on that, how he felt about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know how Baraka viewed the SDS. I've never read any,
or the SAS, I suppose.
Over the S. Yeah, well, I think that he, yeah, I likely he was sympathetic to the SAS, just given he was putting together this thing called the Committee for a Unified Newark, which was, radical and definitely located in the Black Power movement, but was aimed at kind of practical political electoral goals, like electing Kenneth Gibson. So I imagine he was quite sympathetic to the SAS. Angela Davis, maybe somebody in the audience knows this, but I'm not sure if she was still in Oakland, or had she gone to Germany at this point? I don't know when she went to Germany.
I think she's in San Diego at this point, but I was more just thinking about sort of the fractures within the radical groups that, at least in Colombia, largely come down on racial lines, so that the SAS kick out the white protesters. But Davis talks a lot about highly contentious meetings among different versions of Black radicals. On a lighter note, Gary mentions that Pink Floyd also borrowed the lyrics, not just Jefferson Airplane. And I did notice that one of the actions of Up Against the Wall was to create free tickets for visitors to Woodstock by cutting down the fences around that famous farm where Woodstock was held, so that people could charge in. So that's a bit odd as one of their actions.
Yeah. So they're a really interesting group, and some of their connections were actually so there's the kind of Weathermen direction, the Weather Underground direction that some of this goes in, which of course Mark Rudd is one of the founders of the Weather Underground in '69, so the next year. And then that movement migrates to Chicago, obviously for the DNC convention, and also Detroit is there's a Detroit connection that's very strong to this kind of world. Another band that was involved was called MC5, right? And I'm sure some of you know MC5. Yeah, I mean, if you get a chance, I was going to play a video of a live performance of this Jefferson Airplane track, but we don't really have time. But go watch it on YouTube. It's incredible, because the song itself is like very like kind of happy flower power. It's the title of the song is "We Can Be Together." So it is not at all the kind of militant, smash the windows type lyrics from Baraka's poem. Yeah.
I want to ask one more question. If anybody from the audience has one, I can defer. But I was looking at the board game that you put up, and putting that next to the Kenneth Koch poem. So I think that one thing people seem fascinated by, and that maybe poetry has some answer or insight into, is the desire to want to role play the other side or get into the mindset of the other side. And I think that that's maybe partly why people were hanging out around Low Library. So the jocks were hanging out there too, because they wanted to understand what this moment was about, even if they completely disagreed with it. So I guess it's not so much a question as a kind of musing. Do you think that poetry has something to say about this kind of desire to imagine the felt experience and commitments of people who are on the other side of what was, as you said, a violent and very fractious divide?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the poetry of the 60s just too often gets kind of categorized into these binaries, radical, mainstream, militant, not militant. And I think part of what I do in my research more broadly is to look at how a poet like Koch straddles these life worlds of radicalism. And he was a professor at Columbia, like institutional establishment, very established prestige institutions. And think about the poetic forms that allow poets to, kind of shuttle between worlds. And I think role-playing is a really apt way of describing what Koch does in his poems, for sure. He's constantly sort of inhabiting weird voices of made-up poets. So in The Pleasures of Peace, he's having this kind of a contest with another poet whose name is Finogle. Of course, Finogle is not a real person. It's just, it's kind of contemporary New York poet that Koch makes up. And Finogle is also writing a poem called The Pleasures of Peace. And so they're competing to see who can include the maximum number of pleasures in the poem. And Finogle finally, instead of continuing to write his poem, jumps out of the window, right? And he doesn't die, but he's in the hospital after he leaps out of the window as a kind of, protest act, right? The radical kind of I don't know, like martyrdom. And he's in the hospital, and Koch's talking to him about his poem, like, well, did you finish your poem? And Finogle's like, no, I have to confess, I stopped writing it. And Koch in the poem says, but, surely you'll go down in posterity. Your act will be greater than any poem I could ever write. And so there's this ironic, definitely ironized relationship to poetry's role in politics at the time. So and Lorenzo Thomas too does this a lot. He's somebody who would be interesting to say more about, but he actually does go to Vietnam and fights in the Vietnam War, whereas most of the folks who are really involved in SDS don't. So there's also that playing out too. But yeah, role playing, it's a fun way to think about it.
Well, thank you so much for that. It looks like the role-playing game, you get to choose being either the administrators or the students. So it really is zero sum. And maybe that's partly what Up Against the Wall was telling Kenneth Koch in their act. Thanks so much, Lucas. We should close it down now, as it is promised to be a curatorial short. But I welcome everybody who's attended to come to our meeting next month, when our very own university archivist will be talking about the beginning of Morningside campus in the late 19th century. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Lena, and thanks to the audience for coming and sticking around.